My mother stood in the Cook County courtroom, screaming that I was an addict destroying my father's legacy. She told the judge I could not manage a doghouse, let alone a multi-million-dollar estate. Her slick husband smirked, mistaking my silence for fear. They did not know I had spent 6 weeks x-raying the foundations of their fake empire. Then Judge Halloway took off her glasses and leaned forward. My name is Teresa Weatherford, and if there is one thing I understand better than anyone else in this city, it is how things break. I make my living analyzing failure. When a parking garage collapses in the suburbs, or a suspension bridge develops a hairline fracture, I am the one they call to calculate the exact moment the stress became too much to bear. So, as I stood in the mud of the cemetery on a gray Tuesday morning, watching them bury my father, I was not crying. I was assessing the structural integrity of the people around me. And the woman standing across the open grave, draped in enough black lace to outfit a Victorian widow, was a facade waiting to crumble. Arthur Weatherford had been a man of steel and concrete, a builder who believed that a handshake was as binding as a rivet. He had built half the skyline of Chicago with his own 2 hands and a stubborn refusal to cut corners. Now he is gone. The silence in my chest was heavy, a dead weight that I carried with the straight spine he had taught me to have. I adjusted my glasses, feeling the cold rain seep into the shoulders of my trench coat. I stood alone. I preferred it that way. The woman in the lace was Elena, biologically. She was my mother, in every practical sense. She was a stranger who had decided to crash this funeral like it was a movie premiere. She was sobbing loudly, clutching a handkerchief to her face, her body shaking with a grief that felt rehearsed in front of a vanity mirror. It had been 20 years since I had seen her face in person. 20 years since she packed 3 suitcases and told a 14-year-old girl that she was leaving because she was suffocating. I remember her words with perfect clarity. She had looked at me, her eyes devoid of warmth, and told me I was too boring, too serious, and frankly, a little embarrassing. She said I lacked the spark required to be part of the life she deserved in Hollywood. Standing next to her, holding a massive black umbrella to shield her from the elements, was Marcus Sterling. I knew him by reputation, and none of it was good. He was a developer who specialized in flashover substance, the kind of man who put gold leaf on the lobby ceiling while using subpar rebar in the columns. He looked like a shark in a $3,000 suit, his eyes scanning the mourners not with sympathy, but with calculation. He was looking for networking opportunities. He was looking for weakness. After the service, the funeral procession moved to the law offices of Henderson and Associates for the reading of the will. The room was paneled in dark oak and smelled of old leather and expensive cologne. Elena sat in a wingback chair, sipping water and dabbing at dry eyes. Marcus stood behind her, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder. I sat at the far end of the conference table, my hands folded on top of my tablet. Mr. Henderson, my father's attorney for 30 years, did not waste time. He adjusted his spectacles and read from the document in a flat, monotone voice. To my ex-wife, Elena, I leave nothing. As our divorce settlement 20 years ago satisfied all financial obligations. Elena gasped. It was a sharp, ugly sound. Marcus tightened his grip on her shoulder. To my daughter, Teresa Weatherford, Henderson continued, looking up at me with a brief, sad smile. I leave my entire estate. This includes 100% ownership of Weatherford Construction, all personal assets, and the deeds to the land development specifically designated as the Phoenix Project. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds before it was shattered. This is absurd! Elena shot up from her chair, the grieving widow act vanishing instantly. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the mahogany walls. Arthur cannot do this. That land is worth millions. He cannot leave a construction empire to her. Look at her. She is a mouse. Marcus stepped forward, his voice smooth, trying to coat the venom in honey. Now, Elena, calm down. What your mother means is that this is a heavy burden. Running a company, managing a project the size of Phoenix, that is a job for experienced developers, for men who know the game. She is not capable, Elena shouted, pointing a manicured finger at me. She has always been weak. She is fragile. Arthur told me she was seeing a therapist. She is probably medicated right now. You cannot give that kind of power to someone who is mentally unstable. I did not move. I did not blink. I simply watched them, in my line of work. You learn that the loudest cracks often come from the weakest materials. I looked at Elena, really looked at her, and saw the desperation etched around her eyes. This wasn't about me. This wasn't about Arthur. This was about money. The Phoenix Project was a massive tract of undeveloped land near the waterfront, a potential gold mine for a developer like Marcus Sterling, who was rumored to be leveraged up to his eyeballs in debt. "Is there anything else, Mr. Henderson?" I asked, my voice calm, level, and utterly devoid of the emotion they wanted to provoke. "No, Teresa. That concludes the reading," Henderson said, ignoring Elena's sputtering. "Fine," I said. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. "I will be in touch regarding the transfer of deed titles next week." I walked past them. I did not look at Elena. I did not acknowledge Marcus. I treated them like graffiti on a wall I was inspecting, an eyesore, but structurally irrelevant. "Don't you walk away from me," Elena screamed. "I am your mother. You are sick. Teresa, you are a depressed, lonely girl who plays with blocks. You will run this into the ground." I kept walking. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, cutting off her voice. I drove home to my apartment in the city, the windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the Chicago sleet. I felt a strange sense of hollowness, but I pushed it down. I had work to do. I had a company to evaluate. I had a legacy to protect. But the vultures were faster than I anticipated. That evening, as I was reviewing the preliminary schematics for the Phoenix Project, my doorbell rang. I expected it to be a food delivery. Instead, a man in a cheap windbreaker stood there. He verified my name and shoved a thick envelope into my hand. "You have been served, ma'am," he mumbled and hurried away. I closed the door and opened the envelope. It was a court summons. Petitioner, Elena Sterling. Subject, emergency conservatorship of the person and estate of Teresa Weatherford. I scanned the legal jargon, my blood turning to ice. The petition claimed that due to severe depression, history of self-harm, and substance abuse, I was mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs or the assets of the late Arthur Weatherford. It cited a stress-induced incident from my college years, a single visit to a counselor when I was 21, as proof that I was unhinged. They were not just trying to contest the will. They were trying to erase me. They wanted to take my voice, my rights, and my father's legacy. And they were using the legal system to do it. I looked out the window at the city lights blurred by the rain. Elena had called me boring. She had called me weak. But as I stared at the lies printed on the heavy bond paper, I didn't feel weak. I felt the cold, hard resolve of steel hardening under pressure. They wanted a fight. They had absolutely no idea what kind of engineer they were up against. The headlines hit the newsstands before the coffee in my mug had time to cool. The Chicago Sun-Times ran it on page 4, but the local tabloids plastered my face on the front cover, under a grainy photo of me leaving the funeral. Looking pale and stoic, the caption read, "The unstable heiress to the Weatherford Empire." It was a masterpiece of fiction woven from threads of half-truths. Marcus Sterling had clearly called in every favor he was owed by the city's gossip columnists. I sat at my kitchen island, reading the legal complaint that had been filed alongside the media blitz. The sheer malice of the document took my breath away. Elena and her lawyers had dug up an incident from my junior year at the University of Illinois. It was finals week. I had not slept in 3 days. Fueled only by espresso and the terrifying pressure of a structural dynamics exam, I had fainted in the library from exhaustion and dehydration. A campus medic had checked my vitals and suggested I see a counselor for stress management. In Elena's filing, this single event was transmuted into a chronic history of sedative abuse and documented suicidal ideation. They painted a picture of a woman so fragile she could shatter at a loud noise. A woman who needed her mother's benevolent hand to guide her through life. It was sickening. But as I read further, I realized the cruelty had a very specific architectural purpose. It was a demolition job. They were placing charges at the base of my reputation to bring the whole structure down so they could loot the rubble. The target was explicitly the Phoenix Project. My father had bought that land intending to build affordable, sustainable housing for the working class. The file I held in my hands, however, revealed Marcus's counterproposal, hidden in the addendums of the conservatorship request. He wanted to rezone the land. He planned to build the Sterling Sanctuary, a high-end luxury resort and casino complex. I knew Marcus's style. He would build it fast. He would build it cheap, and he would charge a premium. But looking at the projected budget numbers in the file, something else clicked in my engineer's brain. The material costs were too high for the quality he usually delivered, yet the labor costs were suspiciously low. It smelled like money laundering. He needed my land not just to build, but to clean cash for his silent partners. I flipped to the evidence section. They had hired a private investigator. The report was a joke. A collection of telephoto shots of me standing in alleyways or staring at brick walls. The investigator noted that I frequently engaged in bizarre behavior, standing motionless for up to 20 minutes staring at nothing. They did not understand that I was looking at load paths. I was analyzing shear cracks in masonry. To them, I was a madwoman staring at space. To me, they were blind. Then I saw the witness list. My stomach dropped. Jessica Miller. We had been roommates for 2 semesters. We had lost touch years ago. The affidavit signed by her stated that I used to hear voices and ramble incoherently about invisible disasters. I remembered those nights. I would talk out loud to myself, working through complex equations for wind loads on high-rise structures. I was not hearing voices. I was doing math. But Marcus had clearly found her. And judging by the new car I had seen on her social media feed just yesterday, he had paid her handsomely to forget the difference between calculus and psychosis. I threw the file onto the table and grabbed my coat. I needed to see Saul. Saul Berkowitz had been my personal attorney since I started my own career, separate from my father's company. His office was a small, dusty room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old case law. He looked tired. He rubbed his temples as he looked over the mountain of slander Elena had piled up. "Teresa," Saul said, his voice gravelly, "I am going to be honest with you. This looks bad. In a conservatorship case, the burden of proof is on them. Yes, but the court of public opinion? That works differently. Marcus has already poisoned the well. If we fight this in a long, drawn-out trial, your name will be mud. Obsidian might fire you just to stop the bleeding. The government contracts? You can kiss those goodbye. Nobody wants a forensic engineer who is legally labeled insane." "I am not insane." "Saul," I said, my voice tight. "I know that. You know that." Saul sighed, leaning back in his creaking chair. "But they have a mother crying on camera and a witness swearing you talk to walls. Judge Halloway is tough, but she is human. My advice? We settle. Give them the Phoenix land. Keep the construction company. Keep your freedom. Let Marcus have his playground. It is just dirt. Teresa." I stood up and walked to the window. I looked out at the Chicago skyline, a grid of steel and stone that held millions of lives. My father had taught me that a building is only as honest as its foundation. If you compromise the foundation to save money or time, the collapse is inevitable. Giving in to Marcus and Elena would be a compromise. It would be letting a fault line exist where there should be solid rock. "It is not just dirt, Saul," I said, turning back to him. "It is my father's legacy. And if Marcus builds that resort, he will cut corners. People will get hurt. I cannot let that happen. Teresa, please," Saul pleaded. "You are an engineer, not a crusader. You fix buildings. You do not fight sharks like Marcus Sterling." I adjusted my glasses. The fear I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a cold, humming energy. It was the same feeling I got when I walked into a building that was about to fall down. a hyper-awareness of every vector and force. "You are right. Saul," I said. "I am an engineer. That is exactly why I am not going to settle. They are attacking my mind? Fine, I will attack their physics. They want to play legal games? I will play engineering games." I left Saul's office without signing the settlement papers. The sun had set, and the city was awash in the orange glow of streetlights. I did not go home. I drove straight to the industrial district, to a nondescript gray building with a secure keypad entry, Obsidian Structural Solutions. It was 11 o'clock at night. The offices were empty. I swiped my keycard, praying my access had not been revoked yet. The light turned green. I stepped inside, the smell of concrete dust and ozone welcoming me like an old friend. I walked past the empty cubicles to the back, to the forensic lab. This was my sanctuary. This was where we brought the pieces of disasters to find out why they happened. I turned on the lights. The room was filled with hydraulic presses, electron microscopes, and 3D modeling stations. I sat down at my computer and pulled up the encrypted server. If I was going to fight a war, I needed ammunition. I did not need character witnesses. I did not need a PR firm. I needed data. I opened a new project file. I named it Project Vulture. Elena and Marcus thought I was a helpless little girl who played with blocks. They thought they could bury me under a pile of lies. But they forgot one crucial thing about the laws of physics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. I was about to become the reaction. I typed in a search query for Marcus Sterling's construction permits over the last 10 years. Then I pulled up the geological surveys for every site he had ever built on. I was going to x-ray his entire life, and I was going to find the crack. There is always a crack, and once I found it, I was going to drive a wedge right into it and watch his world come down. The glass walls of Director Vance's office usually offered a commanding view of the Chicago River, a view that reminded me of the city's endless capacity for reinvention. Today, however, the blinds were drawn. It was a subtle signal, but in my profession, you learn to read the smallest indicators of stress before the collapse happens. I sat in the leather chair, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for the structural failure of my career. Director Vance was a good man. He was a pragmatic man. He ran Obsidian Structural Solutions with the precision of a Swiss watch, and right now, I was a gear that had become magnetized, disrupting the entire mechanism. He did not look me in the eye when he spoke. He focused on a point somewhere near my left shoulder, likely staring at the framed diploma on the wall behind me. "Teresa," he began, his voice heavy with a regret that felt genuine, but ultimately useless. "You know how sensitive our government contracts are, the Department of Transportation, the insurance conglomerates, the federal oversight committees. They require absolute transparency. They require stability." I knew where this was going. I could have finished the sentence for him. "The article in the Sun-Times," I said, my voice steady. "And the segment on the morning news." Vance nodded. "It is becoming a distraction. We received 3 calls this morning from the risk assessment officers at the Interstate Bridge Authority. They are worried about the validity of the inspections signed off by someone whose mental competency is being debated in court. My mental state has nothing to do with my ability to calculate load distributions," I countered. Though I knew it was a futile argument, logic does not work on public relations nightmares. "I know that," Vance said, finally looking at me. "But perception is reality in this business. Until this legal matter with your mother is resolved, we have to put you on administrative leave, effective immediately." The words hit me with the force of a wrecking ball. Administrative leave. It was a polite way of saying I was being exiled. "And my access?" I asked. Vance slid a small plastic tray across the desk. "I need your badge, Teresa, and your secure server tokens." I reached into my purse. My hand trembled. Just once, a micro-tremor that I quickly suppressed. I pulled out the ID card that had been my passport to the hidden skeleton of the city. For 10 years, that piece of plastic had defined me. It said I was trusted. It said I was capable. It said I was the one you called when the world started to crack. Placing it in the tray felt like removing a vital organ. The plastic made a hollow clatter against the wood. "We will keep your position open," Vance said, trying to offer a lifeline. "Just clear this up. Pay them off if you have to. Just make it go away." I walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box with a few personal items, a spare calculator, a framed photo of a bridge I had saved in St. Louis, and a stress ball. The security guard, a man I had greeted every morning for 5 years, looked away as I passed. I was already a ghost. The drive home was a blur of gray concrete and red taillights. When I unlocked the door to my apartment, I craved silence. I wanted to sit in the dark and calculate the probability of my life ever returning to normal. Instead, I found Brian in the living room. Brian was a plastic surgeon. He was successful, charming, and possessed a jawline that looked like it had been chiseled by Michelangelo. We had been dating for 8 months. It was a relationship built on a mutual appreciation for aesthetics and order. He fixed faces. I fixed buildings. We both corrected flaws, or so I thought. He was standing by the window, holding a glass of scotch. The television was paused on a freeze frame of my mother's tear-streaked face from her latest interview. "You are home early," Brian said. He did not come over to kiss me. He stayed by the window, keeping a safe distance. "I got suspended," I said, placing my box on the kitchen island. Vance pulled my clearance. Brian swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "I am not surprised. Teresa, I had 2 cancellations at the clinic today. Patients mentioned they saw my girlfriend's name in the tabloids. They asked if the instability runs in my circle." I felt a coldness spread through my chest that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "I am sorry about your cancellations, Brian, but I am currently fighting for my life and my father's legacy." He turned to face me, his expression perfectly composed. It was the face he wore when telling a patient that a nose job would not fix their marriage. "Are you? Or are you just being stubborn?" I watched the full interview. "Teresa, your mother makes some compelling points. She seemed genuinely heartbroken. She talked about the pills in college, the isolation." "She is lying," I said, the anger rising in my throat like bile. "She is reading a script written by a man who wants to turn a housing project into a casino. Is she?" Brian took a step closer, his eyes searching mine, not for truth, but for defects. "Because you do withdraw. Teresa, you are obsessive. You sit in here for hours staring at blueprints. You don't have friends. You barely talk to anyone but me. Maybe she is not entirely wrong. Maybe you do need help." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw a man who spent his life smoothing over imperfections, covering up scars, and selling the illusion of perfection. He did not care about the truth. He cared about the image. He was just like Elena. He was just like Marcus. To him, a crack was something to be plastered over, not investigated. "She offered a settlement, didn't she?" Brian asked, his voice softening into a persuasive purr. "Just give them the land. Teresa, you have your own money. Why drag this out? Why drag us through the mud? It is embarrassing. Just pay her to shut up. It is embarrassing." That was his concern. Not that his girlfriend was being framed, not that a corrupt developer was about to endanger thousands of lives. It was embarrassing for him at the country club. I walked over to the door and opened it wide. "Get out," I said. Brian blinked, his composure faltering for the first time. "Excuse me? Get out. Brian, take your scotch. Take your perfect reputation and get out of my apartment." "You are being irrational," he sneered, setting the glass down hard on the counter. "This is exactly what your mother was talking about. You are manic." "I am not manic," I said, my voice ice cold. "I am structural, and I just realized that you are a non-load-bearing element. You are dead weight, and I am removing you from the design." Brian stared at me for a long moment, his face flushing red. Then he grabbed his jacket and stormed out. He slammed the door behind him, the sound echoing through the empty apartment. I locked the deadbolt. I was alone. No job, no boyfriend, no family. I walked into my study, the room Brian hated because it was filled with clutter. It was filled with models, bridges, skyscrapers, domes. I picked up a small steel model of a truss system I had designed for a convention center in Denver. I ran my fingers over the cold metal joints. In engineering, there is a concept called the yield point. It is the stress at which a material begins to deform plastically. Before that point, if you release the pressure, the material snaps back to its original shape. After that point, the change is permanent. The material is altered forever. Elena and Marcus thought they were breaking me. They thought they were crushing me under the weight of their lies, but they didn't understand the material they were working with. They had pushed me past my yield point. I wasn't going to snap back to the quiet, passive girl I used to be. I was permanently changed. I looked at the model, studying the intricate lattice of tension and compression. Everything has a breaking point, I whispered to the empty room. Even lies. I was done crying. I was done defending myself. It was time to go on the offensive. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the desk lamp burning. It cast long, sharp shadows against the walls. I was alone, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel lonely. I felt focused. The distraction of trying to maintain a normal life was gone. Now, there was only the problem, and I was going to solve it. I stopped thinking about my mother. Analyzing Elena was a waste of cognitive resources. She was a non-structural element, purely decorative and hollow, shifting with whatever wind blew the strongest, to understand the collapse of my life. I needed to study the load-bearing wall, and that was Marcus Sterling. You do not bring down a building by chipping at the paint. You go for the foundation. I spent the next 3 nights in the obsidian lab, sleeping on a cot I kept in the supply closet. I was technically suspended, but I still had friends in the industry, old superintendents, disgruntled project managers, and archivists who remembered my father's kindness. I made calls on burner phones. I traded favors. I did not ask for gossip. I asked for blueprints, change orders, and delivery manifests for every major project Marcus had developed in the last 10 years. By Friday morning, I had a hard drive full of data. I brewed a pot of coffee and began the forensic audit. The pattern emerged within 2 hours. It was subtle, buried in the noise of construction logistics, but to an eye trained to spot anomalies, it was glaring. Marcus Sterling was a magician. His projects, mostly mid-rise residential complexes in the suburbs, were consistently finishing 30% ahead of schedule. In the construction world, finishing on time is a miracle. Finishing 30% early is a statistical impossibility unless you are bending the laws of physics or the laws of the state. I cross-referenced the timelines with his material procurement logs. The math did not add up. The volume of concrete and tonnage of steel ordered were significantly lower than what the architectural drawings required. You cannot build a 10-story building with the materials for a 7-story building, not unless you want the top 3 floors to end up in the basement. I needed physical proof. Data on a screen was one thing. A physical void in a concrete column was another. I selected a target, the Oak Ridge Heights, a sprawling apartment complex in Cicero, Illinois. Marcus had completed it 4 years ago. It was fully occupied, filled with families, retirees, and young couples starting their lives. On paper, it was a luxury development. In my spreadsheet, it was a mathematical contradiction. I swapped my business suit for a gray maintenance jumpsuit I kept in my trunk. I pulled my hair back into a tight bun and put on a pair of safety goggles. I grabbed my field kit, a heavy Pelican case containing a Pundit Lab ultrasonic pulse velocity tester and a patchometer, which is essentially a high-powered metal detector for rebar. I drove to Cicero in a rented van. The Oak Ridge Heights looked impressive from the street. The brick facade was clean, and the landscaping was manicured, but I wasn't interested in the skin. I drove around the back to the service entrance. I waited for a delivery truck to exit, then slipped through the gate before it closed. I walked with purpose. If you carry a clipboard and look annoyed, people assume you belong there. I found the access door to the sub-basement. It was unlocked. That was a code violation right there, but it was lucky for me. I descended into the gloom. The air down here was cool and smelled of damp earth and stale water. This was the skeleton of the building, the place where the massive concrete columns transferred the weight of hundreds of lives into the ground. I approached the central support pillar, a massive square of gray concrete labeled C14 on the schematics I had downloaded. According to the blueprints, this column should be reinforced with 16 number 8 steel bars, tied with number 4 stirrups every 12 inches. I opened my case. I applied a layer of coupling gel to the concrete surface to ensure a good connection for the transducers. I pressed the transmitter against one side of the column and the receiver against the other. The device sent a high-frequency sound wave through the material. The speed at which the sound travels tells you the density of the material. Sound travels fast through solid concrete and steel. It slows down when it hits cracks, voids, or honeycombing. I watched the readout. The pulse velocity was sluggish, too sluggish. I moved the probes, mapping the interior of the column. I switched to the potentiometer to locate the steel. The device beeped, a lonely, high-pitched sound in the silence of the basement. I swept it across the face of the pillar, marking the location of each bar with yellow chalk. 1, 2, 3, 4. I moved up. 5, 6. I stopped. I checked the calibration. I ran the sweep again. There were only 10 bars. The design called for 16. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. It was not just column C14. I checked C15 and C16. The pattern was identical. Marcus had shorted the vertical reinforcement by nearly 40%. He had spaced the stirrups at 20 inches instead of 12, drastically reducing the column's ability to withstand shear forces or seismic activity. This building was not a home. It was a tomb waiting for a trigger, a heavy snowstorm, a strong wind event, or just the slow creep of material fatigue could bring the whole structure down like a house of cards. I sat back on my heels, the damp cold of the concrete floor seeping into my knees. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a terrifying finality. This was why Marcus was so desperate. He was not just greedy, he was drowning. You do not cut 40% of the steel to buy a nicer yacht. You do that because you are insolvent. You do that because you are bleeding cash. The early completion times? He was skipping cure times for the concrete. The low material costs? He was buying substandard grade steel and pocketing the difference. But how did he pass the inspections? You cannot hide a missing rebar cage from a city inspector, unless the inspector is looking the other way. That was the key. Bribery. Massive, systemic bribery. Marcus was likely paying off a dozen city officials to sign off on these death traps. That required liquid cash. Untraceable. Large sums of cash. He was probably servicing a mountain of debt to keep this scheme floating. He needed the Phoenix project not to build a resort, but to mortgage the land the second he got the deed. He needed the capital to pay off the loans he took to pay the bribes that hid the fraud. It was a Ponzi scheme built of concrete and lies. I reached into my bag and pulled out a core drill. It was loud, but I didn't care. I needed a sample. I drilled into the side of the column, the diamond bit grinding through the aggregate. I pulled out a cylinder of concrete about 4 inches long. It was porous. I could see air pockets with the naked eye. It looked like cheap sidewalk cement, not structural grade material. I took out my infrared camera and snapped pictures of the column. The heat signature revealing the uneven distribution of density. I photographed the chalk lines showing the missing steel. I photographed the core sample next to today's newspaper to prove the date. I packed my equipment with trembling hands. I wasn't trembling from fear anymore. I was trembling with rage. Above my head, in the lobby. There were probably children playing. There were people cooking dinner, watching television, sleeping in beds that were supported by criminal negligence. Marcus Sterling had called me unstable. He had called me a disgrace, but he was the one who had built a monster. I walked out of the basement, the sample heavy in my pocket. I had gone in looking for a crack in his story. I had found a fault line that ran through the entire city. I had the physics, I had the math, and now I had the concrete proof. I was going to bury him. Finding the weak link in a chain is often easier than testing the strength of the steel itself. In the architecture of the Sterling family, the weak link was not Elena. She was merely the facade, the structural flaw, the hairline fracture that could bring the whole house down. Was Julian? I knew Julian only by name and the occasional uncomfortable glance across a holiday dinner table years ago. He was 24 years old. Marcus's son from a first marriage that had ended long before Elena came into the picture. He was a quiet, nervous young man with an architecture degree from a mid-tier university and eyes that always seemed to be searching for an exit. I had done my research. Julian was currently listed as a junior project manager at Sterling Development, a title that sounded impressive but, in reality, meant he was the glorious errand boy his father bullied into submission. I tracked him down to a coffee shop 3 blocks from the active construction site of the riverfront lofts. Another one of Marcus's high-speed projects. It was 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Julian was sitting alone at a corner table, hunched over a laptop and a pile of blueprints. Looking like he had not slept in a week, he was tearing a paper napkin into tiny confetti-like shreds. It was a nervous tic, a sign of stress fatigue. I bought a black coffee and walked over to his table. I did not approach him as a stepsister. I did not approach him as the villain his stepmother was painting in the press. I approached him as a senior engineer walking onto a job site. "Your cantilever calculations are off," I said, placing my cup on the table. Julian jumped, knocking his knee against the table leg. He looked up, his face pale. When he recognized me, panic flared in his eyes. He started to scramble to gather his papers. "Teresa," he stammered, "I can't talk to you. My dad said if I see you, I have to call the lawyers immediately. Please, just go away." "Sit down, Julian," I said. My voice was not loud, but it had the weight of 10 years of field experience. He hesitated, then sank back into his chair, looking around to see if anyone was watching. "I am not here to discuss the will. I am not here to talk about Elena or the Phoenix Project. I am here because I looked at the filings for the riverfront lofts this morning." "The lofts are fine," he said, his voice rising in a defensive pitch that cracked slightly. "We are on schedule." "You are ahead of schedule," I corrected him. I pulled a chair out and sat opposite him. "Which is the problem? I saw the concrete pour logs from last week. You poured the 3rd-floor slab on a Tuesday and stripped the forms on Thursday. 48 hours. Julian, in this weather, the concrete has not even reached 30% of its design strength." He looked down at his hands. The napkin was now a pile of white dust. "The additives," he mumbled. "Dad said we used high early strength accelerators. I checked the invoices," I said, leaning in. There were no accelerators delivered to the site. Just standard Type 1 Portland cement. If you strip those forms that early, you are introducing microcracks into the slab before it even bears a load. You are compromising the deflection limits. "Why do you care?" he snapped. Trying to summon some of his father's arrogance but failing miserably. "You are just trying to hurt him. You are trying to find dirt." "I am trying to find out why a 24-year-old architect is signing off on safety inspections that a blind man would reject," I said. I reached into my bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a copy of a material receipt I had dug up, cross-referenced with a compliance report. "This is your signature, isn't it?" Julian stared at the paper. It was a receiving document for 2 tons of rebar. The problem was, the building specifications called for 5 tons. His signature was right there at the bottom, certifying that the full shipment had been received and installed. He went silent. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. "Do you know what happens when a floor slab fails, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice clinical, detached. "It is not like in the movies. It does not happen in slow motion. It is instantaneous. The shear connection snaps. The concrete pulverizes. And everything standing on that floor, furniture, appliances, people, drops 12 feet in less than a second. The kinetic energy crushes the floor below it. It is called a pancake collapse." "Stop it," he whispered. "You studied architecture." I continued, relentless. "You took the ethics courses. You know the math. Look at me and tell me that building is safe. Look me in the eye and tell me you would sleep in one of those units." He looked up. His eyes were wet. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked terrified, not of me, but of the truth I was forcing him to see. "He makes me," Julian said, his voice barely audible over the hiss of the espresso machine. "He says I'm too soft. He says I worry too much about the books and I don't understand how the real world works." He brings the papers to my desk and stands there. He puts his hand on my shoulder and squeezes until it hurts. He says, "Sign it, boy. Don't be a disappointment like your mother." So I sign it. I felt a flash of pity, but I suppressed it. Pity would not save the people who moved into that building. "He is using you, Julian," I said. "Marcus is not signing those documents. He is too smart for that. He knows the corners he is cutting are criminal. He is insulating himself. When the inspectors finally come, or when the lawsuits start, or God forbid, when someone gets hurt, he is going to point to the paperwork. And whose name is on the line? Not Marcus Sterling, Julian Sterling." Julian shivered. "He is my father. He wouldn't let me go to jail. Marcus would throw you under a cement truck if it meant saving a percentage point on his profit margin," I said brutally. "He is setting you up as the fall guy. You are the architect of record. You are the site supervisor. In the eyes of the law, the negligence is yours." I saw the realization hit him. It was a physical blow. He slumped in his chair, the image of a young man whose idol had just crumbled into dust. He knew I was right. He had likely suspected it for months, lying awake at night, doing the same mental math I had done, hoping he was wrong. "What do I do?" he asked, his voice trembling. "If I talk, he will destroy me. He will cut me off. I have student loans. I have nowhere else to go." "You have a conscience," I said. "And right now, that is the most expensive thing you own. You have to decide what it is worth." I stood up. I did not offer him a solution. I did not offer to save him. He had to make the choice himself. That was the only way the testimony would hold up when the time came. "I am going to court next week," I said. "I am going to bring down this house of cards. You can be standing next to me, helping me dismantle it safely, or you can be inside it when it falls. But make no mistake, Julian, it is coming down." I turned to leave, but stopped and looked back at him one last time. "One more thing. That signature? That is forgery if you were coerced. But you have to prove the coercion. Keep the emails. Keep the text messages. And for God's sake, stop signing death warrants." I walked out of the coffee shop and into the cold Chicago wind. I did not look back. I knew I had planted the seed. Julian was terrified of his father. Yes, but I had introduced him to a new fear. The fear of his own guilt. The fear of being the architect of a tragedy. And in my experience, guilt is a much stronger force than obedience. It expands over time. It creates pressure. And eventually, it blows the containment. I had found my witness. I just had to wait for him to break. In my line of work, we often perform what is called a destructive test. We deliberately overload a beam or a column until it fractures, recording every groan and pop of the material to understand exactly how much punishment it can take before it fails. For the upcoming deposition, I decided to perform a destructive test on myself, or rather, a simulation of one. Elena and Marcus wanted a broken woman. They wanted the narrative of the fragile, neurotic daughter who crumbled under the weight of her father's empire. If I walked into that deposition room wearing a tailored suit and wielding a binder full of forensic evidence, they would panic. They would circle the wagons, shred documents, and bury the money trails so deep even I could not find them. I needed them arrogant. I needed them sloppy. I needed them to believe that the demolition was already complete. So, on the morning of the deposition, I did not put on my armor. I put on a costume. I chose an oversized gray sweater that swallowed my frame, making me look smaller, frailer. I did not wash my hair, pulling it back into a messy, loose ponytail that suggested days of neglect. I skipped the concealer. letting the dark circles under my eyes, which were real, thanks to the night spent in the lab, stand out in stark relief against my pale skin. I even practiced my posture in the mirror, rounding my shoulders, casting my eyes downward, rehearsing a nervous tremor in my hands. When I walked into the conference room at the offices of Bradford, Sterling, and Associates, I felt the air change. Mr. Bradford, Elena's pit bull of a lawyer, sat at the head of the table. He was a man who smelled of expensive aftershave and moral flexibility. He looked at me, and I saw the shark-like glint in his eyes. He smelled blood in the water. "Ms. Weatherford," Bradford said, not bothering to stand up. "Please, take a seat. This is a formal deposition. You are under oath." I sat down, keeping my eyes fixed on the polished mahogany table. I gripped my water glass with both hands to hide the fact that they were steady, forcing them to shake just enough to make the water ripple. "I understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Speak up for the stenographer, please," Bradford barked. "I understand," I said, a little louder, injecting a wobble into the vowels. To my left was a large mirror that covered nearly the entire wall. It was a one-way glass. I knew they were back there. Elena and Marcus. I could practically feel their heat radiating through the glass. They were watching the show, waiting for the climax where I would break down and confess my incompetence. Bradford began the assault. He demanded my medical records. He asked about the sleeping pills I had been prescribed 5 years ago. He asked about the voices Jessica Miller claimed I heard. "I just get overwhelmed," I stammered, looking at the table. The noise, the pressure. My father expected so much. "So you admit you are unable to handle the stress of daily operations?" Bradford pressed. Leaning forward, "I don't know," I said, letting a tear, summoned by holding my eyes open without blinking for 40 seconds, slide down my cheek. "I just want it to stop. The reporters, the cameras. I can't sleep. I can't think." I paused, taking a shaky breath. If I sign the papers," I let the sentence hang in the air. "If you sign the conservatorship agreement," Bradford said, his tone softening into a predatory soothing, "your mother will take on the burden of the business. You will be taken care of. A monthly allowance, $5,000, no responsibilities. You can go to a retreat, rest. $5,000, I repeated, as if it were a fortune. And I wouldn't have to go to the construction sites anymore? Never again, Bradford assured me. I need to think about it, I said, wiping my nose on my sleeve, a calculated gesture of unrefined despair. But I think I want to settle. I think you are right. I am not like my father. I could feel the celebration happening behind the mirror. I imagined Marcus high-fiving the air. They had won. The annoying engineer's daughter was capitulating. She was trading a multi-million-dollar empire for a monthly pittance and a chance to hide in a hole. When I left the office, I kept up the act until I was safely in my car and 3 blocks away. Then, I sat up straight. I adjusted my rearview mirror and wiped the fake tear tracks from my face. My eyes were dry, and my mind was sharper than a diamond drill bit. They took the bait. Over the next 3 days, the surveillance on me dropped to 0. The private investigator Elena had hired disappeared. Why waste money tracking a woman who was about to surrender? More importantly, my inside sources told me that the shredders at Sterling Development had gone silent. Marcus was no longer worried about hiding his tracks because he believed he would own the company and the ability to bury the evidence legally by the end of the month. He was focusing entirely on the victory lap. He was busy planning the press conference where he would announce the benevolent takeover of Weatherford Construction, while he was picking out tie colors for the cameras. I was deep in the basement of Obsidian Structural Solutions. I had assembled a small, elite team, 2 structural analysts I had mentored, and a forensic software specialist named David, who could model a tsunami if you gave him enough processing power. We were building a virtual model of the Oak Ridge Heights complex. Feed in the core sample data, I instructed David. Reduce the compressive strength of the concrete in columns C14 through C20 by 40%. Remove the shear reinforcement as per my scans. On the massive monitors, the wireframe building glowed blue. Now, I said. Apply the load. Simulate a wind event. 40 miles per hour. Standard Chicago gust. David typed the commands. On the screen, the building shuddered. The columns turned from blue to yellow, then orange. Increase the load, I said. Full occupancy, furniture, live load. The columns turned red. Now, I said, my voice cold. Trigger the failure at C14. We watched in silence. The virtual column buckled. The load transferred instantly to the adjacent pillars, which were already stressed beyond their limit. It was a domino effect. The second-floor slab sheared off its supports. It slammed into the first floor. The entire east wing of the building collapsed into a pile of digital rubble in less than 4 seconds. My God, David whispered. There are 300 people living in that building right now. We are going to get them out, I said. But first, we need to prove who put them there. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a notification from an encrypted email server. Sender. Anonymous. Subject. What you asked for. I opened it. It was from Julian. He had not written a message. There was only an attachment, a zip file containing over 500 scanned pages. I downloaded it and opened the first document. It was a purchase order from a steel supplier in Gary, Indiana. It was billed to a shell company I recognized from my initial research. The order was for grade 40 rebar, non-structural use only. I scrolled down. There was a second invoice, this one from Sterling Development to the project investors, billing them for grade 60 high-tensile seismic steel. Marcus was buying scrap metal and billing for military-grade protection. He was pocketing the difference, which amounted to nearly $200,000 per floor. I scrolled further. Julian had included the internal emails. From Marcus Sterling, Site Supervisor. Message. I don't care about the cure time. Pour the next floor. If the inspector asks, give him the envelope in my desk drawer. Get it done. I leaned back in my chair. The hum of the servers filled the room, a sound I found infinitely more comforting than the empty platitudes of lawyers. I looked at the simulation of the collapsing building, and then at the invoices that explained exactly why it would fall. I had the physics, I had the money trail, and now, thanks to a terrified boy who finally found his conscience, I had the smoking gun. I imagined Elena and Marcus right now. They were probably toasting with champagne, laughing about how easy it had been to break me. They thought I was a cracked foundation, ready to crumble. They did not realize that I was not the building. I was the earthquake. I closed the laptop and stood up. I walked over to the whiteboard where we had mapped out the case. I picked up a red marker and drew a thick circle around the date of the hearing. Pack it up, I told the team. We have everything we need. I looked at the digital wreckage one last time. A smile touched my lips, but it did not reach my eyes. That is enough concrete, I said softly, to bury them all. The courtroom in the Cook County Circuit was a windowless box of polished mahogany and stale air, designed to intimidate anyone who walked through its double doors. It smelled of floor wax and the nervous sweat of 1,000 defendants who had sat in these chairs before me. But the most imposing feature of the room was not the architecture. It was the woman sitting on the bench. Judge Regina Halloway was a legend in the Illinois legal system. She was a woman of 60 with steel gray hair, cut in a severe bob, and eyes that could seemingly drill through concrete. She was known for 2 things: an encyclopedic knowledge of civil law and a complete intolerance for theatrics. Rumor had it, she once held a lawyer in contempt for taking too long to adjust his tie. As I sat at the defendant's table, my hands folded demurely in my lap, I watched her. She was reading the case file, her face a mask of stone. I hoped that behind that granite exterior, her bullshit detector was calibrated as finely as my ultrasonic pulse equipment. Mr. Bradford, Elena's attorney, rose to give his opening statement. He buttoned his suit jacket with a flourish. a gesture practiced in front of a mirror to convey gravitas. "Your Honor," Bradford began, his voice dripping with a syrupy, manufactured sorrow. "We are not here today out of greed. We are not here out of malice. We are here out of love, a mother's love. We are here to save a young woman from herself." He gestured toward me. I kept my head down. Staring at the grain of the wood on the table, I had to maintain the illusion. To the world, I was broken. To the court, I was fragile. "Teresa Weatherford is a brilliant woman," Bradford continued, pacing the floor. "But brilliance often comes with a terrible price. Her mind, unable to cope with the tragic loss of her father, has fractured. We are asking the court to grant temporary conservatorship to her mother, Elena Sterling, not to control her, but to protect her, to protect the legacy of Arthur Weatherford from the erratic, dangerous impulses of a woman who has lost her grip on reality." He sat down, looking solemn. It was a good speech. If I did not know better, I might have felt sorry for me too. Then, it was Elena's turn. She walked to the witness stand like a widow in a Greek tragedy. She was wearing a black dress that was modest but clearly cost more than my first car. She carried a small silk handkerchief, which she twisted nervously in her hands. It was a prop, of course. Everything about Elena was a prop. "Mrs. Sterling," Bradford asked gently, "can you tell the court about your relationship with your daughter?" Elena sniffed. She dabbed at a dry eye with the silk cloth. "I love her," she said, her voice trembling. "I have always loved her, but Teresa has always been difficult, even as a child. She was solitary. She did not play with other children. She just sat in the corner, stacking blocks, talking to herself. And how has her behavior been since her father's passing?" "Worse," Elena sobbed. "So much worse. She has isolated herself completely. She has no friends, no partner. She spends all her time in that dark laboratory. She is obsessed with disaster. She sees danger everywhere. We went to lunch last year, and she wouldn't sit at the table because she said the ceiling beam looked tired. Who says that? Who thinks like that?" I bit the inside of my cheek. I remembered that lunch. The beam had a visible deflection of 2 inches and a water stain indicating rot. The restaurant was closed by the health department 3 months later, but here, in this room, my vigilance was being painted as paranoia. This was gaslighting on an industrial scale. She was taking my professional competence and twisting it into mental illness. "She imagines enemies," Elena continued, gaining confidence as the judge remained silent. "She thinks people are watching her. She thinks buildings are going to fall on her. It is a delusion, Your Honor, a persecution complex." "Do you have evidence of this erratic behavior?" Bradford asked, teeing her up for the kill shot. "I do," Elena said. She nodded to her lawyer, who handed a thick manila envelope to the bailiff. "Exhibit A, Your Honor," Bradford announced. "Photographs taken over the last 6 weeks." The bailiff handed the photos to Judge Halloway, then placed copies on the projector for the court to see. The first image appeared on the screen. It was grainy, taken with a long-range lens at night. It showed me standing in the middle of a muddy construction site at 3 a.m. My hair was wild, blowing in the wind. I was holding a flashlight, staring up at the skeleton of a high-rise. I looked haggard. I looked like a ghost haunting a graveyard. "This was taken at the Riverfront Project," Elena narrated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Security guards found her wandering there in the middle of the night. She was touching the concrete. She was whispering to the pillars, Your Honor. Normal people do not break into construction sites at 3 a.m. to talk to cement. She is sick." I remembered that night. I was not whispering to the pillars. I was recording voice notes about the spalling I had found on the lower supports. I was touching the concrete to feel for vibration from the passing train line, checking for resonance issues. But without the context, without the engineering degree, the photo just showed a woman who had lost her mind. The next photo was even worse. It was me in the alley behind the Oak Ridge Heights apartments. I was on my knees, digging in the dirt near the foundation. I looked like I was burying a body. In reality, I was taking soil samples to check for water table saturation. She is a danger to herself, Elena cried, the tears flowing freely now. If she is left in charge of the company, she will destroy it. She will fire everyone. She will tear down perfectly good buildings because the voices in her head tell her they are unsafe. I cannot let her do that to her father's memory. I sat perfectly still. My lawyer, Saul, put a hand on my arm, a silent instruction to remain calm. He did not need to worry. I was not going to explode. Not yet. I was letting the pressure build. I was letting them pile the load higher and higher, unaware that I was reinforced with truth. I looked over at the gallery. Marcus Sterling was sitting in the front row. He was not looking at Elena. He was looking at his phone, hiding it behind the pew in front of him. He typed a quick message, then leaned over to the junior associate sitting next to him. "Tell the bank we will have the deed by 5 o'clock. I saw him mouth. "The judge is buying it," he smirked. It was a small, tight expression of victory. He looked at me, his eyes cold and mocking. He saw a woman in an oversized sweater, shrinking into her chair. He saw a victim. He had no idea he was looking at an executioner. "Mrs. Sterling," Bradford said, wrapping up his examination. "Is there anything else you want to say to your daughter?" Elena turned to face me. The courtroom went silent. This was her big finale, the moment she had rehearsed in front of her vanity mirror. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust that was so potent I could almost taste it. "Teresa," she said, her voice trembling with theatrical emotion, "please, let me help you. Look at you. You are a mess." I did not respond. I did not blink. I just stared at her, my face a blank slate. I denied her the reaction she craved. I gave her nothing but silence. The silence stretched out. 5 seconds, 10 seconds. It infuriated her. The mask slipped. Just for a fraction of a second, the grieving mother vanished, and the narcissist appeared. Her eyes narrowed. Her jaw tightened. She could not stand being ignored. She could not stand that I was not crying, not begging, not playing the role she had written for me. "Say something," she snapped, her voice rising an octave. I remained silent. "Damn it, Teresa!" she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at my face. She stood up in the witness box, ignoring the startled gasp from the gallery. "Look at her. She is catatonic. She can't speak a word. She is a total disgrace to the Weatherford name." Her voice echoed off the high ceiling, sharp and ugly. The veneer of the loving mother had cracked wide open, revealing the jagged, rusty steel beneath. The courtroom froze. The echo of her scream hung in the air like dust after a demolition. Marcus stopped smiling. He reached out as if to pull her back down. But it was too late. I shifted in my chair. I looked up at the bench. Judge Halloway had stopped reading. She slowly closed the file folder in front of her. She took off her reading glasses and folded them with a deliberate, terrifying slowness. She looked at Elena, who was standing panting in the witness box, realizing too late that she had screamed in a court of law. Then, the judge turned her eyes to me. There was no pity in them, but there was something else, a question, a spark of recognition. It was time. The silence that followed my mother's scream was absolute. It was the kind of vacuum that occurs right after an explosion. When the air has been sucked out of the room and the debris has not yet started to fall. Elena stood in the witness box, her chest heaving. Her finger still pointed at me like a loaded weapon. She looked wild. Her carefully constructed mask of the grieving, benevolent matriarch shattered by her own temper. She expected a reaction. She expected me to cry, or to shout back, or to curl into a ball. She expected the judge to bang the gavel and admonish her for the outburst, cementing her role as the desperate mother pushed to the brink, but the gavel did not come down. Judge Regina Halloway sat motionless. She did not look at Elena. She did not look at the bailiff. She was looking at me. For the first time all morning, the stone facade of her face seemed to soften, replaced by a sharp, piercing scrutiny. She reached for the new file folder that Saul, my attorney, had quietly slid onto her bench moments before Elena's tirade. It was not the medical records Bradford had demanded. It was my professional portfolio. The judge opened the folder. The only sound in the room was the rustle of paper as she turned a page. Then another. Then another. Marcus Sterling shifted in his seat. He was smart enough to know that silence in a courtroom is rarely a good sign for the plaintiff. He nudged his lawyer, Bradford, who cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor," Bradford said, trying to regain control of the narrative, "I apologize for my client's emotion. You can see how distressing this situation is for her. The defendant's total lack of effect. Her unresponsiveness is clear evidence of her incapacity." Judge Halloway ignored him. She continued to read, her eyes scanning the lines of text with intensity. She stopped on the third page. She tapped her finger against the document, a rhythmic, deliberate tap that sounded like a clock ticking down. Then, she took off her glasses. She folded them slowly and placed them on top of the file. She looked up, and her gaze swept over Elena, dismissing her as one would dismiss a buzzing fly. Before locking onto Mr. Bradford, she leaned forward. It was a small movement, just a shift of body weight over the bench, but it felt like a cliff face shifting. The air in the room grew heavy. "Counselor," Judge Halloway said, her voice quiet but carrying to the back of the room without a microphone. "I have a question for you. Do you actually know who is sitting at the defense table?" Bradford blinked, confused by the question. He gestured vaguely in my direction. "Yes, Your Honor. That is Teresa Weatherford. As we have established, she is the daughter of the deceased, an unemployed architect who is currently suffering from—" "Stop," Halloway said. It was not a shout. It was a command. "You are wrong." Bradford froze, his mouth half open. "I beg your pardon, Your Honor." "You called her an unemployed architect," Halloway said, picking up the document Saul had given her. "You called her incompetent. You called her a disgrace." The judge turned her eyes to Marcus Sterling in the gallery. He went rigid. 3 years ago," Judge Halloway continued, her voice gaining strength, resonating off the wood-paneled walls. "I was presiding over a racketeering case at the Southern Federal Courthouse. It was a Tuesday. The building was full, 500 people, judges, clerks, defendants, juries. It was raining, much like it is today." She paused, letting the memory settle over the room. Around 10 in the morning, a young woman walked into the main lobby. She did not have an appointment. She did not work there. She demanded to see the facility manager. She told him that the vibrations from the subway construction 2 blocks away were resonating with the frequency of the building's main load-bearing truss in the north wing. She told him that she could hear the steel singing. I kept my head down, but a small smile touched the corner of my mouth. I remembered the sound, a high-pitched whine, almost imperceptible to the human ear, like a violin string about to snap. "The manager tried to throw her out," Halloway said. "He called security. He said she was crazy. He said she was causing a scene." Elena lowered her hand, looking from the judge to me. Confused. This was not in the script. "But this woman," Halloway said, pointing a pen at me, "refused to leave. She pulled the fire alarm. She forced an evacuation. She was arrested on the spot for disturbing the peace. And 20 minutes later, while she was sitting in the back of a squad car in handcuffs, the entire roof of the north wing collapsed. The truss had sheared exactly where she said it would." The courtroom gasped. It was a collective intake of breath. 500 people were standing in the parking lot watching that roof come down, Halloway said, her eyes burning into Bradford. Including me, I was in my chambers directly under that truss. If that alarm had not been pulled, I would be dead. And so would half the federal judiciary of this state. Bradford looked like he had been punched in the gut. He looked at me, his eyes wide with horror. He realized suddenly that he had been painting a hero as a villain. "Teresa Weatherford is not an unemployed architect," the judge declared, her voice ringing with authority. "She is the lead forensic structural engineer for Obsidian Structural Solutions. She is the person the government calls when they need to know why a bridge fell or why a tunnel flooded. She is the premier expert on structural failure in the Midwest. Elena took a step back in the witness box. Her face had gone pale, the flush of anger replaced by the gray shock of reality. "I didn't know," she stammered. "She never talks about work. She plays with blocks." "She does not play, Mrs. Sterling," Halloway snapped. "She models. She simulates. She analyzes." The judge turned back to Bradford. "You asked the court to believe that her silence is a symptom of madness. You brought me photos of her inspecting concrete at night and told me she was delusional." Halloway leaned back in her chair, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "I know this woman's work. Counselor, I have read her reports. They are precise, they are mathematical, and they are devastatingly accurate." She looked directly at Marcus Sterling. He was sweating now. I could see the sheen of perspiration on his forehead even from across the room. He was a developer. He knew exactly what a forensic engineer did. He knew that if I had been looking at his buildings, I wasn't hallucinating. I was gathering evidence. "If Teresa Weatherford is sitting there silently," Judge Halloway said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register, "it is not because she is catatonic, it is not because she is afraid, and it is certainly not because she is crazy." The judge paused, letting the weight of her words crush the remaining air in the room. "It is because she has already done the math. She has inspected your foundation. She has found the cracks." Halloway leaned forward one last time, her eyes locking with mine. At that moment, we were not judge and defendant. We were two survivors who understood the weight of collapsing things. "She is quiet," the judge said to the terrified room, "because she is simply waiting for your structure to fall down." I lifted my head. I adjusted my glasses. I looked at Marcus, then at Elena, and finally at the stunned lawyer. I let the facade of the broken girl drop completely. I sat up straight, squaring my shoulders. The transformation was instant. The fragile victim vanished, replaced by the engineer who had spent a decade walking through rubble to find the truth. I saw the realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. He wasn't fighting a family dispute. He was standing in the path of a controlled demolition, and the countdown had already reached 0. I stood up. The movement was fluid, deliberate, and completely devoid of the tremor I had feigned for the past hour. I walked around the defense table, not with the shuffling gait of a medicated recluse, but with the commanding stride of a site director inspecting a foundation pour. I took the clicker from Saul's hand. He didn't say a word. He just smiled, plugged his laptop into the courtroom's audiovisual system, and sat back to watch the fireworks. "Your Honor," I said, my voice clear and steady, cutting through the lingering tension like a laser cutter. "My mother told you that I'm obsessed with danger. She told you that I imagine catastrophes. She is absolutely right." I clicked the remote. The screen behind the witness box, which had previously displayed my pathetic-looking medical history, flickered and changed, a high-resolution, three-dimensional heat map of the Oak Ridge Heights apartment complex appeared. It was a sea of blue and green, punctured by angry, glowing red veins running through the support columns. "I am obsessed with danger," I continued, turning to face the gallery, looking directly at Marcus Sterling. "Because for the last decade, this man has been building tombs and selling them as luxury condominiums." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Marcus turned a shade of purple that usually precedes a cardiac event. Bradford, his lawyer, jumped up. "Objection! This is ambush. These documents were not entered into discovery." "Overruled," Judge Halloway said instantly, her eyes glued to the screen. "You opened the door to her mental state and her professional competence. Counselor, she is now rebutting your claims. Sit down." I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in on column C14, the one I had drilled into in the sub-basement. Next to the digital model was the photograph of the core sample I had taken, showing the porous, honeycomb texture of the concrete. "This," I said, pointing to the screen, "is a load-bearing column from the Oak Ridge Heights complex in Cicero. 300 families live there. According to the architectural drawings filed with the city, this column should be 5,000 PSY. high-density concrete, reinforced with 16 number 8 steel bars. What you are looking at on the screen is a thermal scan I took 3 nights ago. I walked toward the jury box, though there was no jury, only the judge. I wanted her to see the conviction in my eyes. The red areas represent voids, I explained, slipping into the cold, hard vernacular of my trade. Air pockets. The scan shows a density consistent with sidewalk pavement, not structural supports. And the steel? There are only 10 bars. Marcus Sterling shorted the shear reinforcement by nearly 40%. He saved approximately $12,000 on this column alone. Multiplied by 80 columns in the building, that is nearly $1 million in stolen materials. That is a lie, Marcus shouted from the gallery, gripping the wooden railing in front of him. She is faking the data. She is crazy. Data does not hallucinate, Mr. Sterling, I said, not even turning to look at him. And neither does physics. This building has a safety factor of less than 1.1, in lay terms, Your Honor. That means if Chicago gets a wind gust over 60 miles per hour, or if we have a minor seismic tremor, the shear capacity of the first floor will be exceeded. The failure will be brittle and catastrophic. The building will not lean, it will simply cease to stand. I clicked the remote again. The screen changed to a complex flowchart of shell companies and bank transfers. This was the work of my forensic accountant friend, layered over my structural findings. But why risk mass murder for $1 million? I asked rhetorically. Because he is broke. The Sterling Sanctuary, the resort he wants to build on my father's land, is a myth. It does not exist. Look at the dates. I pointed to a series of loan applications. Marcus is leveraged to the hilt. He owes 4 distinct shadow banks over $20 million. The loans are coming due next month. He does not want the Phoenix Project land to build a resort. He needs the deed so he can use the land as collateral to refinance his debt. He is trying to plug a financial hole with my father's legacy before his creditors break his legs. Elena was shaking her head violently in the witness box. No. Marcus told me he said we were going to retire. He said the resort was for us. He lied to you, Elena, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He does not love you. He loves the land you were supposed to inherit. This is all speculation, Bradford yelled, desperate to stop the bleeding. Where is the proof of intent? Where is the proof that he ordered these material cuts? You have thermal scans. Fine. Maybe it was a contractor error. You cannot pin this on Mr. Sterling without a paper trail. We have the paper trail, a voice said from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Julian Sterling stood up. He was shaking like a leaf in a storm, clutching a thick black binder to his chest. He looked at his father, then at me. I gave him a small nod. Julian, sit down, Marcus hissed, his eyes bulging. Don't you dare! Come forward, young man, Judge Halloway commanded. Julian walked past his father. He walked past the lawyers. He approached the clerk's desk and placed the binder on the surface. It landed with a heavy thud. These are the originals, Julian said, his voice cracking but audible. My father keeps a separate set of books. These are the change orders he forced me to sign. They show the orders for the substandard steel. They show the cash withdrawals used to bribe the city inspectors on the Oak Ridge project and the riverfront lofts. It is all there. The dates, the amounts, the signatures, his signatures. You ungrateful little bastard! The scream ripped through the courtroom. Marcus Sterling launched himself over the railing. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. He lunged for Julian, his hands reaching for his son's throat. Bailiff! Judge Halloway shouted, standing up. 2 court officers were on him in a second. They tackled Marcus to the floor before he could reach Julian. He struggled, cursing and kicking, his expensive suit tearing at the shoulder. I gave you everything, Marcus screamed, his face pressed against the carpet. You weak, pathetic loser! I made you! Julian did not flinch. He looked down at his father with a sadness that was far older than his 24 years. No, Dad, he said softly. You didn't make me. You tried to break me. But I didn't break. Elena was screaming now, a high-pitched wail of denial. Stop it! Stop it! This isn't real. Teresa, tell them to stop. You are making this up. I looked at my mother. She was standing in the witness box, gripping the railing. Her face streaked with real tears this time. She looked from her arrested husband to the son who had betrayed him, and finally to me. She wanted me to fix it. She wanted me to tell her that her life wasn't a lie, that she hadn't married a monster, that she hadn't abandoned her own child for a mirage. I cannot stop the truth, Mother, I said calmly. I gestured to the screen, where the red veins of the failing building still glowed, and to the binder that contained the mathematical proof of their greed. You can cry all you want, I said, adjusting my glasses and looking her dead in the eye. You can scream, you can act, but you cannot gaslight the data. The numbers do not care about your feelings, and neither do I. The bailiffs hauled Marcus to his feet and dragged him toward the holding cell. The click of the handcuffs was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard, crisper and more final than any gavel. Judge Halloway remained standing, her eyes wide as she looked at the evidence Julian had provided. She looked at me, and for a moment, the ghost of a smile touched her lips. She understood. We had just performed a controlled demolition of the Sterling Empire, and it had fallen exactly into its own footprint. Judge Halloway did not waste a single second. She looked at the binder of evidence Julian had placed on her bench, then at the chaos unfolding near the holding cell, where Marcus was still struggling against the bailiffs, and finally at Elena, who stood trembling in the ruins of her social standing. The judge picked up her gavel and brought it down with a sound that cracked through the room like a gunshot, demanding absolute silence. The petition for conservatorship is dismissed with prejudice, Judge Halloway announced, her voice echoing with the finality of a steel door slamming shut. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented by Mr. Julian Sterling and the forensic testimony of Miss Weatherford, I am declaring this courtroom a crime scene. I am remanding Marcus Sterling into immediate custody without bail. Bailiff, secure the doors. I am transferring this entire file to the District Attorney's Office and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are looking at multiple counts of fraud, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. As if on cue, the double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. I had called them an hour ago. A team of officers from the Economic Crimes Unit marched in, their badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. They were not there for a family dispute. They were there for a takedown. They swarmed Marcus, replacing the bailiff's handcuffs with their own heavy-duty restraints. He was read his rights, but he was screaming so loudly about his lawyers and his political connections that I doubt he heard a word of it. Elena stood alone in the witness box. The officers ignored her. She was not the mastermind. She was just the beneficiary. But as she watched her husband being dragged out, kicking and cursing, the reality of her situation settled in. Her assets were frozen. Her reputation was incinerated. The lifestyle she had traded her daughter for was gone. She stumbled down the steps of the witness stand and ran toward me. She reached out, grabbing the sleeve of my blazer. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in black rivulets, making her look like a tragic clown. "Teresa," she gasped, her grip desperate. "You have to help me. I didn't know. You heard Julian. It was Marcus. He did all of this. He lied to me. He told me he was investing the money. He told me you were sick. I am a victim here too. Teresa, I am your mother." I looked down at her hand on my arm. I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just the cold, clinical detachment of an engineer inspecting a failed component. I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my jacket. "You are not a victim, Elena," I said, my voice steady and low. "You stood in this court and called me a disgrace. You lied about my mental health to steal a construction company you have no idea how to run. You were willing to let buildings collapse and people die just so you could keep wearing silk and drinking champagne. I was scared," she sobbed. "I thought I was losing everything." "You are not crazy," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "And you are not scared. You are just greedy. You saw a pile of money and you didn't care who you had to bury to get to it. But greed has a structural cost, Mother, and you just paid the price." I turned my back on her. Behind me, I heard her collapse onto a bench, weeping not for forgiveness, but for her lost fortune. I walked out of the courtroom and into the bright, blinding sunlight of Chicago. I took a deep breath. The air tasted clean. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled. The trial of Marcus Sterling was the fastest in the history of the Illinois Circuit Court. The evidence I had gathered, combined with Julian's testimony, was insurmountable. He was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for fraud, endangerment, and bribery. The Oak Ridge Heights complex was condemned and evacuated, likely saving hundreds of lives before the winter snows could crush the weakened roof. Elena was not charged criminally, as she had plausible deniability regarding the construction fraud, but the civil lawsuit stripped her to the bone. The banks took the house. The government seized the cars. The last I heard, she was working as a receptionist at a small nail salon in a strip mall on the edge of the city, filing appointment cards for minimum wage. She had finally found a job where her only responsibility was to look at other people's manicures. I did not keep the name Weatherford Construction. I wanted a fresh start, a new foundation. I rebranded the company as Weatherford and Associates. We moved out of the old, dusty offices and into a functional, modern space near the river. Our mission statement was simple: safety first, integrity always. We were no longer the biggest builder in the city, but we were the most trusted. Julian came to work for me 2 weeks after the trial. He was shy, still carrying the trauma of his father's bullying, but he had a good eye. I put him on the remediation team. I did not make it easy for him. I made him check his math 3 times. I made him spend days in the mud, inspecting footings. I was a strict mentor, stricter than his father ever was. But I was fair. And for the first time in his life, Julian walked with his head up. He was becoming a real architect, one who understood that a building is a promise to the people inside it. One crisp October afternoon, I stood on the rooftop of the Phoenix Project. We had not built a casino. We had built a mixed-use development with affordable housing, a community center, and a park. It was solid. It was sustainable. I checked the parapet wall, running my hand along the limestone cap. It was perfectly level. I looked out at the skyline. I was 34 years old. I had dismantled a corrupt empire and built a new one from the rubble. I was alone on the roof, but I did not feel lonely. I realized that family is not about whose DNA you share. It is about who stands with you when the load gets too heavy. It is about the people who have the same structural integrity, the same moral fiber. Julian was my family. Saul was my family. The team at Obsidian was my family. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Brian. "Hey T, saw the news about the company. You look great in the article." I was thinking, maybe we could grab a drink? I miss us. I stared at the screen. I thought about his perfect jawline and his empty soul. I thought about how he had told me to pay off my mother because the truth was embarrassing. I didn't even hesitate. I swiped left and hit delete. Then I blocked the number. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and picked up my white hard hat. I put it on, adjusting the strap until it was secure. The wind was picking up, blowing off the lake, but I didn't shiver. I was made of stronger stuff now. "Back to work," I whispered to the city. I turned and walked toward the access door, ready to inspect the next pour. The foundation was solid, and for the first time in a long time, so was I. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to hear from you in the comments section below. Please let me know where in the world you are tuning in from and share your thoughts on Teresa's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Sunday Drama Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button so we can share these stories with even more people. Your support means the world to us.